Well, I had a joy this weekend. The joy is that I could even be here. I was under the weather most of the week and kind of wondering came Friday whether I was going to be able to make the trip, but things seem to have resolved, and apart from a little fuzzy-headedness, I think I'm 95% here today. So sometime last summer, I was contacted by an individual from a psychology department of a major university, and this gentleman was asking whether I had some time to talk to him about a project that he and some colleagues were about to embark upon. You see, they were all concerned about a decline in the overall state of happiness among Americans, and they believed that they had come up with what they thought might be a partial remedy. And so, intrigued, I set a date for a longer telephone conversation. And when we spoke again, this gentleman began by outlining his concern. He said, too many people today are feeling stressed out, and they're lonely. And this is leading to some rather serious health issues, to substance abuse, to depression, and to a decline in personal productivity. I may be running out of steam here. We'll just go this way. So, as a response to what he characterized as this emerging epidemic that already affects upwards of 1/3 of the adult population, this team that he had gathered together had launched a new for-profit startup that is simply called Happy. The objective of this enterprise is to connect sufferers with compassionate, confidential listeners with whom they can open up and freely share their concerns, their troubles. And this is designed as an on-demand service where clients can access this other person on the line at any time for talk sessions of indeterminate length. Happy's sharing economy creates conversations between people who need support and people who are naturally good at providing such support. Rates, their literature says, very affordable, $25 an hour. After this explanation of Happy's mission and purpose, their representative cut to the chase. As a minister, I may know of individuals who would be well equipped to serve as providers, happiness givers, as it were. And these he described as sensitive, caring men and women with a little extra time on their hands. Social work students, retirees, empty nesters, stay-at-home parents, and unemployed millennials. I said, I'll think about it. But happiness, as this brief anecdote illustrates, has become a major concern in today's society, hasn't it? We are told that we have a right to be happy, that happiness should be one of our primary objectives in life. And yet at this moment in history, we seem to be experiencing this happiness deficit. Surely it is a problem that is simply begging for a solution. But another problem arises almost immediately when we pause to ask ourselves, okay, well, what constitutes happiness? What are its sources? How is it maintained? The poet Amy Lowell explained the difficulty in two evocative lines. Happiness to some elation is to others mere stagnation. Is there a one-size-fits-all definition of happiness? Clearly not. We look at people who seem to have everything going for them. Wealth, social standing, what appears to be a stable family life, good health, and yet, by all appearances, they're anything but happy. Their cup is always half empty. As Harvard's Daniel Gilbert observes in his book entitled Stumbling on Happiness, happiness really is nothing more or less than a word that we word makers can use to indicate anything that we please. The problem is that people seem eager to use this one word to indicate a whole host of different things. Commentators on this subject of happiness, Gilbert says, often distinguish between three basic types of happiness. Now, happiness, first of all, can be treated as a feeling, emotional happiness, or as a function of virtuous behavior, doing the right thing. That's moral happiness. Or it can be an altered state of consciousness resulting from the exercise of non-judgmental awareness. That's judgmental happiness. Classical philosophers generally extolled happiness, the kind of happiness that accompanies virtue. For the Buddha and his followers, judgmental happiness was primary because it was an expression of the clear, uncontaminated natural mind. And in neither of these latter two instances, either the classical one or the Buddhist one, in neither of those instances were the emotions placed at the forefront, as is typically the case when we think about happiness today. Indeed, proponents of moral happiness were wont to dismiss the sentiment of happiness as a, quote, cheap, vacuous state of bovine contentment. It was considered perfectly tragic for life to be aimed at nothing more substantive or significant than a feeling, Gilbert comments. And in any case, because each person's feelings of happiness are unique, and because those feelings are aroused by a wide and disparate variety of experiences and stimuli, it's hard to come up with a simple formula for achieving even emotional happiness. So the person who claims to be the happiest when they are free-base climbing Yosemite's El Capitan and their adrenaline is pumping, that makes me shake my head in disbelief. I'm kind of a low-risk kind of guy. Our current president, who needs daily doses of adulation and applause to be happy, well, that likewise is a kind of happiness that confounds me. But that's not to say that feelings are completely irrelevant to happiness. It's only that we may be giving them more weight than they deserve. And moreover, in the realm of feelings, it's all too easy to confuse happiness with sensations that are somewhat analogous, but considerably less fulfilling. So pleasure, for instance. Is pleasure the same as happiness? The problem, cultural anthropologist Ruth Benedict once opined, is not that we are never happy, it's just that our happiness is so episodical. And that comment is particularly pertinent when we talk about the happiness that derives from pleasure. It is, as we know, frustratingly transient, and when it disappears, when it dissipates, we may end up feeling even worse than we did before. Now, I'm sure all of us have had the experience of purchasing something nice for ourselves, going to the store and buying something that we really want. And when we do that, we're all going to feel this slight uptick in our sense of well-being. But then we will watch it subside, and slowly we sink back into the state prior to that particular purchase. That is a measurable phenomenon, because studies, and I may have mentioned this to some of you before up here, studies reveal that the brain chemistry of shoppers changes at the very point that they make a purchase. The individual becomes momentarily happier because a little dopamine has been released as the transaction is completed. And so indeed, the typical customer's pleasure and happiness peak at that very moment, not when that particular item is taken home and actually put into use. The happiness associated with pleasure. It can also work to our disadvantage at times. So consider this phenomena called confirmation bias and the similar way in which this affects our mood. So say we read or we hear something that strongly supports a belief that we hold, a belief about cats or dogs or principles or personalities. Well, when we hear or we read something that confirms our particular biases with regard to something we hold dear, that we hold to be important, then we are again rewarded with this little hit of dopamine, and our happiness quotient rises accordingly. And because such confirmation feels good, we tend to stick with our guns even when we are wrong. So when we relegate happiness to the realm of feelings, we can condemn ourselves to this kind of boom and bust circle that can also entail a significant degree of self-deception. We feel good, hey, it must be right. No, not necessarily so. Moreover, as Barbara Ehrenreich points out, if the feeling of happiness is our paramount concern, then we may seek to avoid exposure to controversy, to conflict, to acts of injustice, because all these things bring us down. They dilute our sense of happiness. Pursuing happiness can thus become a rather narcissistic and socially irresponsible enterprise. Let's talk about pursuit a little more. When our third president composed that famous phrase, "All men are created equal, and they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." With that last phrase, he may have slid off the rails just a little bit. Because the longer I live and the deeper I probe into this subject, the more I am concerned that pursuing happiness for its own sake as an end in itself is indeed a fool's errand. In and of itself, happiness simply cannot be caught. It is rather a byproduct of some other agenda that we establish for ourselves and work diligently to fulfill. Dion Diamond, the University of Wisconsin student who risked his life fighting for civil rights in his native Louisiana, was he pursuing happiness? And in his conversation with Robert Coles, he didn't call it that. Dion spoke of something else: satisfaction. Feeling good about the relationships he was developing and the changes that he was already seeing coming. If you can spend some part of your life doing work like that, he says, then you are darned lucky. Similarly, a woman named Michaela Dreyer. She's a millennial, and she is a registered independent voter who lives in the state of Missouri. She has never been politically engaged heretofore, and like many of her chronological peers, she would rather text than talk on her cell phone. But then after the last election, the political winds began to shift rather noticeably. She began to think a little differently. A lot of the new administration's policies bothered her, as I'm sure they bother a lot of us. But she said to herself, you know, I commute to work a lot, and I have this Bluetooth set up in my car. And so every day, every single day, from December 30th through February the 2nd, Dreyer called her Republican U.S. Senator on her cell phone using the Bluetooth in her car. That became my routine, she says. And further, she reports that it has been really good for my mood. Because when I'm not actually standing up and doing something, then I get dragged down and I start to feel hopeless. So if we're going to fit those two examples into the previously mentioned categories, they resemble moral happiness most closely. When we place ourselves in the service of a worthy cause or an unfulfilled need, it does boost our spirits, just as if you're going to one of those marches for science, okay? And even if there is no guarantee that the efforts that we put forth are going to bear immediate fruit, just the potential for success, if not this season, maybe the next, that can keep us uplifted. This is what Parker Palmer calls the active life, finding one's voice, exercising one's moral muscle. Stewardship belongs in this particular category. The willingness, as Peter Block puts it, to be accountable for the well-being of a larger organization by operating in service to those around us. As stewards, as faithful stewards, we choose service over self-interest, guided by a mature understanding that the causes we care about and ultimately our own personal well-being are best served when we come together, pool our efforts, and assume some collective responsibility. Now, Peter Block is a highly respected organizational consultant by trade, but he describes this as a spiritual as well as a practical enterprise. We want to affirm the spirit, he writes, for there is this deep longing in each of us to invest our energy in things that matter, finding meaning in and treating as an offering what we do. Peter Block was thinking about institutions in general, but he could well have been describing faith communities in particular. For in no other context is this principle of stewardship followed so faithfully. What are the implications for happiness where stewardship is concerned? Numerous studies have shown that people who are active in such communities, whether they be churches, fellowships, synagogues, mosques, Buddhist sanghas, Hindu temples, humanist circles, people who are engaged in these kinds of communities, this kind of a community, do experience a higher degree of satisfaction with their lives than those who eschew such involvement. In the long run, service is likely to be more gratifying than the solitary pursuit of one's own self-interest or happiness. Of course, we have to be sensible here, don't we? Excessive service, that can be wearying rather than uplifting. So we have to learn when to step back, when to take our pulse, because there are times, as Wendell Berry puts it, when we just simply need to rest in the grace of the world. And when we do this, we begin to experience that third category of happiness. It's called judgmental happiness. Because we are now living in the moment, trying to be as open and aware and unencumbered as we can possibly be. Writing in My Antonia, Willa Cather says, "The earth was warm under me, warm as I crumbled it through my fingers. Queer little red bugs came out and moved in slow squadrons around me. Their backs were polished vermilion with black spots. I kept as still as I could. Nothing happened. I didn't expect anything to happen. I was something that just lay under the sun and felt it, like the pumpkins, and I did not want anything more. And I was entirely happy. Perhaps we feel that way when we die," she says, "and become part of something entire, whether it be the sun and the air, or goodness or knowledge. But at any rate, this is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. And when it comes to one, it comes as naturally as sleep." So again, this pursuit of happiness sounds to me a little bit too much like work. A persistent moving towards something that we can never quite grasp, where it's really just as close at hand as a handful of earth. But it's not the earth, of course, that matters. It could be the clouds looking up in the sky. It could be a cup of tea. It could be the cat on the pillow, the dog on the leash, soft strains of music, laughter around the table. We simply invite a time where we can taste what has been given, Wayne Mueller says. Take delight in what we already have and see that it is good and say thank you. When we cultivate such experiences, our sense of appreciation and gratitude expands. Emotional states, gratitude, appreciation, that are clearly connected to happiness. And it is what Jamil the cat was after when he sought out the company of those two friendly trees, whose murmurings of gratitude became for him a source of insight and further inspiration. And so at the end of the story, Jamil thinks to himself, "Thank you, voice, that lets me say love and peace to you today, who have walked on the lane, sat by the trees, and know the secret of what makes us free." So happiness clearly is a little more complex than it might seem at first glance. And it's also rather paradoxical, because as Rebecca Solnit sagely observes, making happiness your primary objective in life, that really gets in the way of becoming happy. Is there a reliable formula we can follow that makes it more likely that we will stumble onto happiness or something resembling it? Well, the ancient Greeks developed a concept that may provide a clue. The concept was eudaimonia. And eudaimonia they defined as the complete and flourishing life, the complete and flourishing life. And so when Bose told his friend Manish that he had no interest in being the head of a company because he was already the head of an enterprise, my own life, that's what he meant. He had discovered eudaimonia, a complete and flourishing life. He didn't need anything else. So honor your relationships, practice stewardship, cultivate gratitude. Forget about finding happiness, and maybe, just maybe, happiness will find you. Blessed be, and amen.